My name is Roger Pulwarty. I work for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States. I'm a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm originally from Trinidad. The work that we do is really focused on small communities, nations, and regions around the world in the ways in which they respond to and build resilience to climate change, especially from the standpoint of how information is used to reduce their risk and to manage their future resistance and resilience to changes in the environment. From the standpoint of how climate and climate change affects us in the region, as people have thought for a long time, and we say throughout I've heard it in parts of the Caribbean, you certainly hear it in Trinidad, that God is a Trinity because we're just south of where most hurricanes are supposed to occur. But it's a mistake to believe that. We have been hit by hurricanes in the past, and we actually feel the tails of impacts, the strong winds from hurricanes when they're moving through the region. There's another concern related to climate change and climate in our area. As some of you might remember, 2009, 2010 was extremely dry. From that standpoint, we began to understand what drier conditions mean in the context of water supply, the impacts on our mangroves and wetlands, and in the impacts of our communities from the standpoint of agriculture. Other impacts related to climate change that would affect us over the long term is, of course, sea level rise. And we think about sea level rise as something that, oh, it's just a small amount. But when you add waves onto that, and you also add the fact that with increasing salt water, you get more intrusion into the nearshore water supply, it begins to be a particular risk, especially during drought. So from the standpoint of our region, we're able to say, into the future, hurricanes will probably be stronger, even though they might not be more frequent. But we're also one of the regions of the world in which the projections for increasing dryness is also large. The Mediterranean, the Southwest US, the Caribbean are three parts of the world in which we're almost guaranteed that it's going to be drier. So when people say, well, how are you telling me it will be drier, but hurricanes might be stronger as well? The answer to that is every desert is shaped by water. Hurricanes can be stronger, but the time in between them will be drier. And so our wet season is projected to be much drier. This matters to agriculture, it matters to our regional food security. We import about $3 billion worth of food into the Caribbean region. Up until the early 70s, Trinidad was a net exporter of food, now we're an importer. And so then we're more vulnerable to changes in our agricultural system, in our water supply, and something that we take a great deal of pride in, which is our natural environment. At the present time, if we were to ask how is climate change being manifested in the region, and especially around Trinidad, there are a couple ways in which this is occurring. One of them, of course, is that we can document changes in sea level rise. And in fact, in the estimates that we did in 2007 for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we now understand that those estimates of sea level rise were much lower than they should have been. In fact, sea level rise is going up faster than we thought. Now, to be able to say that anything that is happening at present can be directly attributed to climate change, anthropogenic climate change, that is human-caused, is a difficult thing to do. We know some piece of it is, but also there are background changes in the environment that is occurring. Sea level rise is going up, there's no question about that. There's a piece of that that is anthropogenic, and there's a piece of that that is natural. What people are experiencing, certainly in Toho, in the Kernahan Kokal, and other places like that, is definitely the loss and erosion of land. That is happening, changes are occurring, and the background sea level rise is increasing. One other way in which we're impacted that is not fully appreciated around, as yet or around our region, is that the oceans are also getting slightly more acidic. We call this ocean acidification because when you add carbon dioxide to the ocean water, especially as it's getting warmer, you get very weak carbonic acid, and that breaks down coral reefs, and it also breaks down nearshore structures, and as a result, we're even more vulnerable. From that standpoint, however, we have to incorporate a couple things into the sea level rise question. If we're then removing our mangroves, if we're removing our own shoreline natural protection, the combination of sea level rise with that creates stronger erosion in the regions that we talked about. So let's take a particular instance. I mentioned the question of drought. Let's talk about floods. One of the things we've been projecting with the studies is that we will see more intense rainfall events, but the time between those will be longer. But when it does rain, it will rain heavily. Why does that happen? A warmer atmosphere holds more water, so that when it drops, a lot more drops at a time. Now that is just the rainfall part of what creates a flood. A flood is really a mix of human and physical or natural events. The human component, of course, has to do with whether or not our drains are cleared, whether or not we've basically covered our land with impervious ground, such as parking lots, such as new buildings. There's no other way for water to make it through the system than over the surface, which results in what we call a flood. So the combined action of our own human management, together with changes in the environment, then produces larger types of flood events than we're accustomed to, because we're combining a large rainfall with a higher amount of runoff from having created impervious ground. In other words, not ground in which water is then percolating through the soil into streams. So when we ask the question, well, what can be done? If we leave it up to international organizations alone, they do the things that benefit international organizations. When we speak about the values within our country, within the nation, the things we've grown up really appreciating, the natural environment, which Trinidad is very fortunate to still have a lot of. And we speak then in terms of what communities can do. So the link between communities, the nation, and its ecosystem services or the natural environment is critical. From that standpoint, we can ask, well, what are our capabilities? Do we see at the local level our own capabilities to change the impacts? And we can. There are very, very simple things we do from the standpoint of how communities plan. We have very good examples around the region, San Souci and elsewhere, in which communities are coming together to say, we will manage our future. We will protect the environment near us. We will make sure our drains are clean. We will make sure that our buildings are insured, and that we're working together to preserve the things that we've come to value in the nation. At the national level, what we need to do is make sure we understand how communities are responding and support the successful approaches that are being taken. So there's very much a strong bent towards understanding how communities can respond and be more resilient. What we have to be sure of is that the communities have the capabilities to do those things. From that standpoint, we can list a set of actions, such as the ones I just mentioned, but more critically than that is just creating the awareness that we're responsible for our future, but we can also shape it. So if we were to speak towards what we can do from the standpoint of the level of national decision making, as we look towards the future, we have to ask the question, how viable are our economic investments over the long term? Where we place buildings, where we put our financial services, where our transportation systems are located, how vulnerable our ports are. Taking the climate change issue into account doesn't really tell us, oh, let's be pessimistic about it. It actually offers a very optimistic view, which is the things we can do to respond to climate are things we should be doing anyway in terms of social resilience. At the local level, all of us grew up understanding and interacting with forests, the beaches, when we grew up with stories of Mama Glow and Papa Boa, all these stories that now our children are losing, but yet brought us closer to an interaction with our environment. From that standpoint, very simple things are within our grasp. Communities, people around the country, more than anywhere else in the world, having been more than a few places, I find the network in Trinidad, the camaraderie, the sense of seeing humor in everything we do, as a way for us to speak together about even things that are difficult, such as adapting to and responding to climate change. What we can do in that context is strengthen our village groups and strengthen our village groups to protect the environment around us. This is not just an environmental issue. When things change, you have more floods, having more natural environment around you reduces the size of those floods. When we have droughts, then those protected areas are the things that we look to for supplies. That's where we look to for our water. So the ensuring that the services provided by the environment are met is critical not only from how we develop our investments, whether it's through tourism or other types of industry, but also from the standpoint of how we maintain our culture.